My name's Phil Wenger. I'm the CEO of the Lancaster County Conservancy, and I, for one, am really excited to see this huge crowd here tonight. I was able to sit through the afternoon lecture, and I will tell you that I wouldn't miss tonight if you paid me. Because this afternoon I came away inspired, truly inspired, and I believe you will be inspired as well. When you stop to think about our fragile world and the ecosystems that support life and our role as humans and as individuals in that system. So you're in for a rare treat tonight, and particularly I'm just thankful that you're here, but I'm also thankful that it's not last night. I think we'd have had a really huge challenge. So obviously this kind of an event wouldn't happen without lots of people and lots of conservation partners, and many of those organizations are represented in this room. I'm not going to call you out. There are a lot of volunteers and a lot of passionate people in this community about that issue. But there are 4 people through which tonight would not have happened if it wasn't for them. So I just want to list them. I want them to wave their hands, and at the end we can give them all a big round of applause. First and foremost is our own Lydia Martin. She's the Director of Education at the Conservancy. Second up, you can applaud as you go, because when you work with Lydia every day, it's just such a joy. The second is Greg Wilson. He's a pollinator and clean water enthusiast, and he's a driving force behind Donegal Trout Unlimited. Thank you, Greg, for your work here. Next, we've got Wendy Brister. Wendy's the owner of Harvey's Gardens, and if you want to buy natives, this is one of the places you want to go. She's also the director of the Native Plant Conference at Millersville, so thank you, Wendy. Last but not least, we have Steve Sod. Steve is has joined this effort lately after a life of public service and a number of other roles, but I just call him a community activist because he's been really good at helping get the political folks and the municipal officials connected to this idea that conservation is something that we all need to do. So thank you, Steve, for your work on our behalf. I call these folks who have passion and make an event like this missionaries and prophets. And I don't use those words like missionary or prophet very lightly. I come from a family of missionaries, but I went to the definition of a missionary just to let you know how much I appreciate the work they do. But a missionary is a person who strongly favors a program or a set of principles, and they go through life attempting to persuade and convert others. And so I would hope that we will have many missionaries in this room tonight after we hear Doug Tallamy's lecture. But the one thing that sets a missionary apart from others is that they do it with zeal. In other words, they have righteousness on their side. And the other word that I used was prophet. And I particularly like the word prophet because prophecy is something that speaks to the future, a future that we can help shape with our own words. And prophecies and prophets in particular have righteousness on their side. And after today, I believe you will leave here energized and motivated to be mission-driven and prophetic. I need to thank F&M, their Center for Sustainable Environment, providing this beautiful venues. We have a whole lot of sponsors that are on posters outside and in the hallway. We have a whole bunch of them, so I won't name all of them, but thank you so much for putting up money to bring Doug here tonight and making this happen. So I want to speak just 1 minute or two on the Conservancy itself. I think most of you in this room know that our number one priority right now is to protect the wild places that remain in Lancaster and York counties, and to make for sure that we set those aside for biodiversity and for humans to go and interact in nature. But what we do alone in setting aside large tracts of natural land is not nearly enough. And as we're going to learn from Doug, there's a whole interwoven life that exists. And so land alone is not enough. We also connect that land to clean water. And in Lancaster County, we don't have our streams clean. More than 50% of them are impaired. And we're at the Conservancy are leading a huge effort to engage all of you in trying to clean our streams and our creeks and our rivers so that we don't have to live in this embarrassed world where we apologize for the water that flows out of this county and down the river and affecting those in the Chesapeake Bay. So you're going to see a lot of activity from us this year around clean water. We're going to get a big water week coming up June 1 to 9th. I know they were handing out flyers, but I hope you will participate in one of those types of events this year. So with that said, We are here today to welcome Doug Tallamy. He's a well-known author. He's a conservationist. He's a guy who's lived his life on his 10 acres, so to speak, and he's going to tell us some of those stories. And he inspires us. This is the smallest of creatures. Things like the insects really do drive this world. And so I look forward to that. He's a professor at the Department of Entomology and Wildlife Ecology at the University of Delaware. He's authored a whole host of research papers, way too many to mention. But he's been writing these books that many of you probably are familiar with, Bringing Nature Home, How Native Plants Sustain Wildlife in Our Gardens, and most recently, The Living Landscape, co-authored with Rick Darkey, which was published in 2014. He joined the Natural Lands Board of Trustees in 2015 because he has a passion for natural lands and how our world functions. So welcome, Doug. Thank you so much.
Thanks very much, Bill. First we'll do a sound check. Can everybody hear me? No. Not real well. How about now? Now? If I talk loud? No. Yes? I don't know what to do. A little louder. All right. If you can't hear, yell again, and I'll just talk louder. By the way, there's some seats down here. You really don't want to stand in the back the whole time. If anybody wants to come sit down. I see some people eating apples. Stop.
Can you speak a little louder?
You can't eat your apple until you promise to take care of the bees that pollinated that apple. All right? You'll promise? Because the apple's not free. It doesn't come from nothing. You know, I could... Should I use this? Is this better? I'll take this out. Let's turn that. No, it was on. It was green. All right, I'm going to hide back here. We're going to talk about making insects, the little things that run the world. I think this goes down. It was on.
It was on.
Yeah.
It was on.
It was on, yeah. Little things that run the world. That's not my quote. That is a quote from E.O. Wilson, Edward O. Wilson. And many of you might recognize it. Ed Wilson is certainly the most famous entomologist, probably of all times, but certainly of our lifetime. One of the most famous biologists of our lifetime. He's a two-time Pulitzer Prize winner, something no other biologist has done, no other scientist has done, I think. He started a number of disciplines on his own, sociobiology and all kinds of things, single-handedly. Very, very famous man. And I was lucky enough to meet old E.O. twice. Once was way back in 1982. I had just gotten my job at the University of Delaware, and there was a small conference on social bees in Colorado, Boulder, Colorado. And it was small enough that they had talks in the morning, and then they had a break, and people simply went outside and milled around during the break. And I went outside, and here's E.O. sitting on the curb, and nobody's sitting next to him. So very boldly and uncharacteristically, I went over and I sat down next to E.O., and he turned and he looked at me, he said, "Hi, I'm Ed Wilson. I don't believe we met." I said, "No, we haven't." We shook our hands and had a nice little chat. And then the break was over, went in, more talks, lunch, more talks, afternoon break. And I went outside, and here's E.O. sitting on the curb. Nobody's sitting next to him. Well, we were buds at this point, so. So I rushed over, and I sat down next to E.O., and he turned and looked at me. He said, "Hi, I'm Ed Wilson. I don't believe we met." That was the first time I met him. The second time I met him was 32 years later. He was getting an award at the Academy of Natural Sciences in Philly. He was getting the Ben Franklin Award. I met Ben, too. And this was an award for lifetime achievement in science, but particularly for his efforts to save life on Earth. He's dabbled in that right from the beginning, but he's gotten very serious about it in his later decades of work, which there's 5 decades of those, by the way. One of the first things he did was write this paper. This is 1987. It was in the first volume of the first issue of Conservation Biology, which was a brand new journal back then. And it was entitled The Little Things That Run the World. He was talking about the importance of conservation of invertebrates. But out of those invertebrates, he's really talking about insects, certainly the most numerous of the invertebrates. And he said some very important things in this paper. He said, life as we know it depends on insects. a new concept back then. People hadn't thought about that. But he listed a number of things. If insects were to disappear, of course, that takes the pollinators with them. And that means the flowering plants, most of the flowering plants would disappear, which would change the physical structure of the terrestrial world. It also would terminate most of the food webs that support our mammals, our birds, our reptiles, our amphibians, even our freshwater fishes. They would all disappear within months. The biosphere would essentially rot because the decomposers, the insect decomposers, would be gone, and it would be left to the bacteria and fungi. And of course, humans would disappear as well in a couple of months. Well, this was 1987, and it was a somber message, but it was fairly theoretical. Nobody was worried about losing the insects, so it was largely ignored. But if we humans depend on insects, why do we have National Insect Killing Week? That's true. That was 1929. But let's face it, we still have National Insect Killing Week, every day. It's springtime, believe it or not, and soon you will hear the ads, I saw an insect, hire me and I will kill it for you. Doesn't matter what it is, just if it's an insect, you have to kill it. This was a campaign to boost the sales of all brands of chemicals to rid the community of insects. So obviously our culture at this point is not appreciating that we absolutely need insects, and it still isn't today. Even entomologists, even people who worry about insects, haven't been worried too much about them actually disappearing because there's the notion that they're doing just fine in our natural areas. Well, there's two main reasons why that's no longer true either. First reason is we don't have that many natural areas anymore, and they're small and isolated. We are pretty much everywhere. We have turned those natural areas into our cities, and the cities, of course, were not designed to support insects, into our suburbs, and they were not designed to support insects, into our exurbs, our rural areas, but they were not designed to support insects either. Of course, we have agriculture. We have 770 million acres of rangeland in the U.S. That's 222 times larger than the area of Connecticut. A lot of area in rangeland, and most of it's overgrazed, and it certainly wasn't designed to support insects. It's designed to support cows. As a matter of fact, food production on planet Earth now takes half of planet Earth. And those areas are not designed to support insects. They're designed to get rid of insects so that we have lots of food. All right, that's the first reason that we ought to be concerned. The second reason is that our natural areas are not quite natural enough anymore. We have this thing we call invasive species, where plants from someplace else have come and displaced many of the native plants that support our native insects. What you're looking at here is White Clay Creek State Park. If anybody's been to the University of Delaware, this is a park right on the north end of the university. And there's a time in the spring where plants from Asia leaf out before plants from North America. And that's what you're looking at here. I took this picture probably the end of March, and all of the green you see are plants from Asia. And it's the usual suspects. It's multiflora rose and Oriental bittersweet and Japanese honeysuckle and privet and miscanthus and barberry and burning bush and ailanthus and Norway maple and paulownia and whatever I forgot. And they're all escapees from our garden. We know where they came from. And now you go into almost any natural area around here, and about a third of the vegetation is from Asia. And of course, those plants are not very good at supporting our insects, and we'll talk briefly about why that is later. So we are winning this war against insects, this undeclared war against insects. We in the United States have not been very good about measuring our insect populations, but two factors have stimulated a lot of research recently, and one is the decline of the monarch, which has gotten a lot of press, and the decline of the honeybee. Not a native insect, but it's declining, so we worry about that. Has stimulated our concern about pollinators. So some people are looking at the fate of native bees in the U.S., and the stats are not good. 50% of the Midwestern native bee species have disappeared from their historic range in the last century. There are 4 species of bumblebees that have declined 96% just in the last 20 years. Now, declining 96%, a lot would say, well, there's still some left. But think if that was your bank account and it declined 96%, you'd be concerned. You'd be concerned. And of course, now those bumblebees are now so rare they are no longer functionally performing in their ecosystem. So they're functionally extinct, even if we can still find a few individuals here and there. 3 species are already extinct. They've absolutely disappeared. 25% of our bumblebee species are at risk of extinction. And bumblebees, by the way, are generalist pollinators. They should be doing just fine. We've got a lot of specialist pollinators out there that nobody's looking at. In Europe, they're measuring lots of things. The orthopterans, grasshoppers, katydids, crickets, 30% of them facing extinction in Europe. Data out of Germany is very discouraging. They've had a long-term insect monitoring program where they put up malaise traps, and they have been monitoring insect populations for the last 29 years. Many of those populations have declined 80% in that 29 years. 46 species of moths and butterflies have already disappeared from Germany. And here's the big one, invertebrate abundance. Invertebrate abundance globally has declined 45%. So the little things that run the world, the little things that support us, are disappearing. We've already lost essentially half of them. This is an ecological crisis that we're just starting to talk about. So we're going to talk about it tonight. We've got to turn that around. And of course, if we eliminate insects, we talked about food webs. Insects are driving those food webs. We're eliminating all the things that eat insects, and it's a lot of things. All spiders eat insects. Our frogs, our toads, all the amphibians depend on insects. They would all disappear if we lost our insects. So do our lizards eat insects, and our rodents, and our bats, our larger organisms, our skunks and possums and raccoons and foxes. Things we think foxes as predators. They are, but 25% of their diet is insects. A full quarter of their diet. Black bears, 23% of their diet is insects. So even these large organisms are depending on insects because insects are really good food. Pound for pound, there's twice as much protein in insect meat as there is in beef. And insects have organs in their abdomen called fat bodies that are loaded with lipids. Those are high-energy compounds that allow creatures to grow quickly and reproduce quickly. So they're extremely valuable sources of food out in the environment. Even creatures that don't eat insects depend on insects, like this sharp-shinned hawk. It's a bird predator. And you might think, well, we can get rid of all the insects in our neighborhood and we'll still have sharp-shinned hawks. But if you get rid of all the insects in the neighborhood, you've gotten rid of all the birds in the neighborhood that this guy's eating. Same thing with our garter snake. It's not eating insects directly, but it's eating the frogs and toads that ate the insects. So that's probably why the State of the Birds report from 2016 is so dismal. 432 species of North American birds now at risk of extinction. Not because there's only 5 or 6 left, but because their populations are declining so rapidly. That is the characteristic of a species in trouble. So now is the time we have to act on that. That's a third of our species, by the way. A third of the North American species in steep decline. We have 1.5 billion fewer breeding birds today than we had 40 years ago. And let me remind you that a billion is 1,000 million. 1,000 million birds that are not here anymore. I see a lot of young people around here, so if you were not here 40 years ago, you don't remember when we had 1.5 billion more breeding birds. So this is a case of shifting baseline. If you don't remember it, you don't miss them. If you don't miss them, it's not a problem. It seems okay. But it's not. It's not okay. We absolutely have to turn this around. For our own good, we can approach this problem entirely selfishly, but we have to do it. So how are we going to do this? I'm focusing a lot recently on private land ownership because 85.6% of the land east of the Mississippi is privately owned. If we all preserved ecological integrity on our properties, if we all had insect populations that are happy and healthy on our properties, if we got rid of the invasive plants on our properties, we'd be mostly done. I could go home. There wouldn't be anything to talk about. Yes, we'd have public lands and we could focus on that then. But so you guys, we all have the key. All we have to do is address this problem at home, and then it's doable. Don't think about global extinctions. Think about the extinctions on your property and what you can do to bring back those creatures at home. And that's what we're going to talk about today. So let's start by saving insects at home. This family has a long way to go. because that landscape was designed for aesthetics only. There's absolutely no thought to what might want to live there. A guy by the name of Roy Dennis, not long ago, said that land ownership is more than a privilege, it's a responsibility. He is 100% correct. The Earth is surrounded by a very thin zone of life called the biosphere. And as far as we know, it's the only planet that has a biosphere. Certainly the only planet that has a biosphere with any type of life that we can relate to. And we've chopped it up into little pieces and said that, Tom owns this piece, Dick owns this piece, and Harry owns that piece. So along with that land ownership, which I don't think we're going to get rid of, comes the responsibility of maintaining the only life in the universe that we know of. You have to do that. And not because it's morally right. We can go there, but if you don't believe that, then the discussion's over. You have to maintain the life on your piece of the biosphere because that's what's supporting you. That's what's supporting your life. That's the connection that we can't escape. Stephen Hawking, of course, passed away last week, I guess. Brilliant physicist. Not too long ago, he said, we're destroying planet Earth, so we better look for another planet. And I don't know if he was kidding. He could have been. He did have a sense of humor. He could have been. But this guy is not kidding. Has anybody seen this book recently out? Michio Kaku? It says, whether due to climate change or the depletion of finite resources, we must face the reality that humans will one day need to leave planet Earth to survive as a species. Don't plan on that. Where are we going? I guess we're going to Mars, where the carrying capacity for life is 0. We're going to leave planet Earth, where life is doing fine if we give it half a chance, because it's easier to create life support systems on Mars. Don't buy into this stuff. I mean, this is fun to talk about, but that's it. It's not going to happen. If we're going to maintain life on the planet, it's going to happen right here, down the road at my neighbor's house, which also was not designed to support life. Well, how do we do this? How do we turn that around? Well, we have to change the criteria for the life support systems that we put in our yards. Those are the plants. We have chosen plants for the last 2 centuries anyway, based on what they look like. They are pretty. They're decorations. We're going to decorate the yard with the prettiest plants we can get. So, we go to a nursery. If we find something pretty, it's okay. Maybe it can be a screen, an anchor, or a focal point, but it's all been about aesthetics. 0 thought to the ecological roles those plants have to play at home now. And I know why. It's because there used to be a lot of nature out there. Let nature do nature. We're going to be humans. We're going to be here. Nature can be someplace else. That kind of worked in the past. It's not working anymore. Now we have to have pretty plants that also support food webs. So we have lots of other creatures around that protect our watershed, that sequester carbon, that help our pollinators, that do all the things that we need, call them ecosystem services, to keep us alive. So we can do this, we must do this, and we have to do it on landscapes that look like this today, or we're going to lose our biodiversity, more than we already have. Remember those 3 species of bumblebees? They're not coming back. Many others are on the brink, so we have to act quickly before we have a full-blown extinction crisis. Let's talk briefly about why we need biodiversity. We need it because it is the plants and animals in our ecosystems that run those ecosystems that keep us alive. Instead of calling them ecosystem services, we should call them biodiversity services, and then maybe people would understand why you need other living things around you. Every time we lose a plant or an animal from one of our ecosystems, that ecosystem does not work as well. There's been research, we don't have time to go into it tonight, that shows there's a direct correlation between the ability of ecosystems to function and the number of species in those ecosystems. As you take species away, ecosystem function declines. And of course, as you add species, it builds. We need as much ecosystems function as possible today because we've got to take planet Earth. Something I forgot to tell you. There was a huge study, the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment Study back in 2005 that told us we have already degraded the planet's ability to support us by 60%. So that is, oh, there it is. There's the study. It just popped up. Yeah, that's the ocean right there. So this was here. This is 170 scientists from around the world. And they measured ecosystem function for 5 years before they published it. Reduce the planet's ability to support us by 60%. So that is the same as taking planet Earth and shrinking it by 60%. At the same time that we keep growing our populations, increasing our economies. You know, I used to shy away from this subject, but we really can't do it anymore. We can grow our population and grow our economies, increase everything at the same rate that the planet is growing. And as far as I know, it's not growing. As a matter of fact, we're shrinking it by reducing its ability to support us. And I know a lot of people roll their eyes, that's not true. Go to South Africa, go to Cape Town, this coming July on day 0, or whatever they call it, when they absolutely run out of water. 2 million people, or is it 4 million people? I don't know. No water. And they're not at war. This is not, this is because there are too many people and not enough water. And that's going to happen all over the planet. There are limits, and we have to start facing them. So we have to take planet Earth here, and we have to increase its ability to support us. We have to rebuild the carrying capacity of the planet. And we know how to do that. We cannot rebuild the Earth's ability to support us without making insects, because of all those vital roles that insects perform. So that's what I want to talk about tonight. I want to talk about what it takes to make an insect and the types of insects that we can focus on making right at home, right in this area. So what does it take to make an insect? Just like every other life form, it takes energy. That energy comes from the sun. It is captured by plants. And through a process we call photosynthesis, it allows us and everything else to eat sunlight. Which, by the way, if our plants disappear, we will have to eat sunlight without them. And that will be tricky. The energy from the sun is captured by the leaf, combined with carbon dioxide from the air. So now we're pulling carbon dioxide out of the air, water from the ground, producing the oxygen nobody talks about anymore, but I still need it. And now the energy from the sun is locked up in the carbon bonds of simple sugars and carbohydrates, food that runs all the food webs on the planet, with the minor exception of some sulfur-based food webs at the bottom of the ocean. And just like going to Mars, they're not going to save the day. So we need photosynthesis. We need the plants to do it. And the more plants we have, the more photosynthesis we have, the more energy we have captured, the more energy we have to pass on to other life forms. So if we're going to make insects, first we make plants. Or we need the plants to make those insects. Now we have to talk about which insects we're going to make. We have a lot of insects out there. And any one of us is not going to be able to make all of them at home. So an estimated 3 to 4 million species worldwide, an estimate because we've only named, I think it's 1.5 million. The others are still unnamed. Many are undiscovered. Many are going extinct before we discover them. We've got about 164,000 named species in the U.S., but again, a lot more unnamed. And it's easy to find an unnamed and undescribed insect. I'm doing moth surveys at my house. That's a real problem, because maybe every 40th or 50th moth I get, nobody's ever seen before. This is hard for me to tell you what it is. All right, so we've got to figure out which ones of those 3 to 4 millions are we going to try to make at home. They're doing everything. They're occupying just about all the niches that are out there. Many of them are stem borers. They're boring inside of plant tissues. Many develop in fallen wood, like our eyed click beetle here. A whole bunch of leaf eaters. Got a lot of insects that are eating the leaves. We just call them insect herbivores. There are many insects that eat roots, like our friend the weevil here. You know, weevils, it's the largest family of organisms in the world, about 40,000 species. But you don't see that many of them. Why not? The adults are nocturnal, and the larvae are underground eating your roots, or they're inside seeds. So they're very cryptic. They're hiding away. Very common, though. We have insects that eat leaf litter. There are 70 species of moths that eat dead leaves on the ground. Who knew? So by the way, every time you rake up those dead leaves and throw them out, 70 species gone. Then we have insects that are developing in our aquatic systems. I call it aquatic goo. Plants that fall into water, into streams, into lakes, into marshes, become that brown muck that's at the bottom. And that's that's the energy force that's driving the creation of our aquatic insects. So we have mayflies and stoneflies and caddisflies. Very common in aquatic systems. And then, of course, if we are making all these different types of insects, we're making the insects that eat those insects. This is an adult horsefly, and you think it eats you. It does try to, but its larva is a predator in that aquatic goo. It's eating the things that live in the aquatic systems. A lot of predatory insects out there. Robber flies, certainly. We have assassin bugs and ambush bugs, lots of predatory bugs. We have our dragonflies. No end to the number of predatory insects. Now, if we make the insects these guys eat, we don't have to worry about making them. They'll make themselves. And then, of course, we have spiders. Spiders are not insects. You just take away one body part and add two more legs, and you've got a spider. But they're important invertebrates, and they're certainly important predators. So they've got to be part of our system. But again, as predators, if we make the insects, the spiders will be there. Okay, each one of these insects form what we call a guild. When they're doing common things, we put them into a guild, and each one of those guilds are necessary to run our ecosystems. But each one of those guilds don't contribute equally to ecosystems. So again, we're going to focus on particular ones. The two most important groups of insects that I want to focus on, that I think we should focus on, and this is debatable, but I'm giving the talk, so I think it's the insects that maintain plant diversity and the insects that contribute the most energy to our food webs. Those are two groups we're going to focus on. So we're talking about pollinators. They're the ones that maintain our plant diversity that are out there. And we're talking about caterpillars. And the caterpillars might be the new part of the story to you. When you look at all the insects out there, the ones that are driving the food webs the most do happen to be the larvae of our lepidoptera, our moths and butterflies, because there's such edible packages and there's so many of them, and so many other creatures eat them. A lot of things don't eat plants directly. They've got to eat the insects that eat plants, and this is most of them. So those are the two groups that I suggest we focus on. Let's talk first about pollinators. Let's talk about what a pollinator is. Believe it or not, there's a lot of confusion about this. A lot of people think that you go out and you look at your flowers and you see an insect at the flower, it's a pollinator. No, it's a flower visitor. And that's a real term. It's a flower visitor. Most of the insects that go to flowers are not successfully transferring pollen from the male part of the flower to the female part of the flower. They're going to the flower to eat the pollen or the nectar or both. Or a lot of predators go to flowers to eat other insects. But just because you see an insect at a flower does not mean it is a pollinator. So a lot of people will plant things like zinnias and butterfly bush and non-native plants that make a lot of nectar, and insects do go there. And they say, helping the pollinators a whole bunch. Well, let's see which ones really are the pollinators. The pollinators are the ones that successfully do move the pollen from male to female, and a lot of times they are quite specialized in how they do that. Why do we need pollinators? If I turn on NPR, if I ask anybody on the street, I will hear we need pollinators because they pollinate our crops. And they do, about a third of our crops. But I see that as a very anthropocentric view of why the world needs pollinators. Maybe that's why humans need pollinators. It was really just part of the story. There you go, a third of our crops. We need pollinators because they do so much more than that. They're doing the pollination of the world. They're pollinating 80% of all plants and 90% of all flowering plants. And I actually recently saw an update on that figure. It was 87% of all plants depend on pollinators, which means if we lost our pollinators, forget our crops, we would lose 80 to 90% of the plants on the planet. Not an option. That is simply not an option. So we should look at the bigger picture. It's not about connecting people with the idea that we need pollinators for our food. We've got to connect people with the idea that we need pollinators so we can continue to live on this planet. We need all those plants. That's the plant diversity. Who are our pollinators? Well, in North America, we have one species of honeybee that's introduced from Europe. We have 4,000 species of native bees. We have 14,000 species of moths and butterflies. And then we have beetles and ants and other types of, syrphid flies, a number of other things that under certain circumstances can do quite a bit of pollinating. There's no doubt that our bees are the most efficient pollinators that are out there, although there are many cases of specialized moths in particular that are pollinating. Many of the butterflies we see going to our flowers regularly are those flower visitors. They're actually pretty poor at pollinating. But that doesn't mean we don't want them. So if we're going to focus on making important pollinators, these are the groups we want to focus on. We're not going to ignore the honeybee. There are entire courses on honeybees. We've got colony collapse syndrome. We want to save the honeybee because they're very good at pollinating a number of the crops we brought from Europe and Asia. But the 4,000 species of native bees and these guys did all of the pollination in North America before we brought the honeybee over. So to ignore these is crazy. And they're important studies. And we've had this idea, you absolutely need honeybees for things like apples. No, the research is showing, no, take the honeybees away, put the native bees back. In other words, stop spraying and killing them all. They do fine. They do all the pollination that's necessary. So now when I tell people we really need to make pollinators in our yard, they say, I'm not going to do that because I don't want any bees in my yard because they're going to sting me. And I understand that, particularly the honeybee. That's the one that's going to sting you. It hurts. I don't like to be stung by the honeybee. But what people are really thinking about is this guy, yellow jackets. That are not bees. They are wasps. They're the most aggressive ones. Those are the ones that are going to sting you. The yellow jackets, the aerial yellow jackets, the ground nesting yellow jackets, the bald-faced hornets, which are simply large yellow jackets that are black and white instead of yellow and black, all closely related. Not that many species of them, but they are social wasps that are protecting their hives. And if you get near their hive, even if they build it under your front porch, they don't like it, and they're going to come sting you. Those are not pollinators. They are predators. They're out there eating my caterpillars. So when people shy away because they're going to get stung, they're worried about the wrong creatures. If you want to get rid of your yellow jackets, go for it. But not these guys. These are native bees that are, most of them, the vast majority of the species are not social. They are not protecting a hive or a small colony. Our bumblebees do have small colonies, but they're very, very non-aggressive. Most of these guys are solitary. They run from you. They come to your flowers. You can pet them. They will not sting you. So walk through your meadow and all the bees, they're not going to sting you. It is not anything you'd worry about. And, again, I have people say, I'm very allergic to bee stings. I've got to carry my EpiPen. I understand that. That's my wife's situation. The only time she's stung is by wasps, and it's not when she's walking through a meadow. So we're worried about the wrong things here when we talk about making pollinators. All right, where do pollinators, where do bees? Let's talk about native bees right now. Where do they nest? 3 main places. They nest in the ground, they nest in woody stems, and they nest in pithy stems. Most of us have all 3 of these things. All of us have ground, I presume. So let's start with that. That's a ground nesting bee. That's a Cleides bee, and they're already out. I saw one the other day just before it started to snow. Not many of them yet. If you have a slight south-facing slope, that's where they prefer, and they will nest in the ground anywhere where the soil is diggable, which is just about any soil unless it's hard-packed clay. They can't get through that. But any kind of loam, even soils that are fairly sandy, they do well in. And they dig a single tunnel down, then make little offshoots off of it and rear young individually in those offshoots. So when they come out, they're very shy. If your shadow hits them, they dive back in, completely harmless. But these are the first bees that you're going to see in the spring. What do you need for them to breed successfully? You need a patch of undisturbed ground. So this is not a place where you're going to be walking frequently because that tamps down their little hole. Some little place that the lawnmower is not going to go over every week. A little place of their own, and that's where they will do well. Pretty easy to meet the needs of our ground nesting bees. Pithy stem nesters will find the plants that where the stem is easily hollowed out. If you cut it open, it's got that white pith in it. So things like hydrangea stems. This is a rose stem. Goldenrod stems. A lot of these they're not really woody, but they're herbaceous type plants that are filled with this pith, easily hollowed out. So this is what they do. They tunnel in like this. Then they make these chambers. They pack the end with pollen and lay an egg on it. The egg hatches. That's the bee larva right there, and it eats that pollen. They're raised entirely on pollen. Then the adult walls it off. They're all females and packs this one with pollen. So this guy's a little bit younger and a little bit smaller. This guy's younger still. He's got more of his pollen. This one just hatched. He's got to eat all this pollen. This one hasn't hatched yet. And when they develop, they then tunnel out through the stem and they start their lives. And they can have, it depends on the species, but maybe more than one generation a summer. But they got to have these pithy stems in order to do that. Then, when it comes time to overwinter, they're in the pre-pupal stage. They finish their development in the fall, and they haven't pupated yet, but they're a pre-pupa, and they're in their little chambers. So where are their chambers? They're in these dead stems that we like to neaten up in the fall. We cut them all down. We either put them through the chipper, mulch them, lay them down so that they rot over the winter time, and there goes our native bee population, our pithy stem nesters. So we have to find a way to preserve some of these stems. I'm thinking of, cut off a bunch of them at the base and maybe tie it up like with the corn stalks we do for Halloween, put them in the back or something. But that's where many of our species are, and we have to be mindful of that. Exact same things going on with some of the woody stem nesters. They love elderberry because it's such a weak wood. They can tunnel through it. Here, they're exit holes of that's one family of bees that is exited from its elderberry stems. Elderberry doesn't live very long. You get these dead stems coming out, perfect for our wood-boring bees. But what do? We neaten up. We prune them out because it's dead and it doesn't look good. But the bees need it. Well, one thing we've come up with, particularly for our woody stem nesters, are bee hotels. Every place I go, we sell bee hotels. You know who loves bee hotels the most? Is us. It's humans. This guy really loves bee hotels. And you know what? They work. They do. The bees come, particularly mason bees and other species will come, and they will form their, they pack one of those holes filled with their pollen, and they rear their young. Unfortunately, research is showing that it's not a great idea for the obvious reason. We're putting all our bees in one basket. When you put a bee hotel like this up and you have no other woody options in your yard, which is a typical suburban situation, the bees come, they're all in one place, and then the bee predators come, the bee diseases come. It's very easy to wreak havoc on these guys. So giving the bees an option for nesting is certainly a good idea. But I would suggest making your hotels really small, maybe 3 or 4 holes at once, and scatter them all over the place. That's the normal situation. Then you're not putting all your bees in one basket. If predators find one of those little bee hotels, they're not going to get all of them. And that's the typical situation. These things are spread out over time and space, and I think we ought to think about that. Okay, what do bees need to reproduce? Well, we know what they need. They need pollen and they need nectar, and they need it all the time. This is one of the 2 things that makes saving our bees a little bit challenging. We have to think about it. Here's data from Jared Fowler and Sam Droege from 2015 in New England, looking at when native bee species are active. And they're active in New England, where it's cold, from March all the way through November, which is just about all the time. And if they're active, they need flowering plants. So if you want to be the best native beekeeper in the world, you've got to have flowering plants, a sequence of them happening in your yard or in your neighborhood all season long. And that takes some thought. What is going to bloom at appropriate times? Often when we get to early July, mid-July, there's a dearth of blooming plants. We finished with our spring blooming plants. We haven't started with our August or our fall blooming plants yet. So a little bit of thought, and we can fill in that blank. One of the things you should think about when you're making a sequence of blooming plants is don't give up on the woody plants. Everybody wants to put in perennials and annuals and thinks that's all that bees go to. But plants like holly, American holly or Ilex verticillata, Ilex glabra, the native hollies, they get little flowers, they're not showy, and the native bees love them. So those are important things. Things like buttonbush, things like clethra, Virginia sweetspire, whatever it's called. And they bloom in that dead zone in the middle of the summer. So they're woody plants. People don't think of them as being important for pollinators, but they really are. Okay, so we have to make a continuous sequence of bloom. Which plants should we use? This definitely is the toughest part of the equation because we're just learning which plants we should use. Sam Droege, he's Mr. Bee. He knows everything about native bees that we know. And he has said lots of things, but this has got to go down in the record books as the most important thing he's ever going to say. I don't want to tell him that because I don't want him to quit at this point. But meet the needs of our specialists, says Sam. And what he means is Think about what the specialist bees need, plant what the specialist bees need, and the generalist bees will follow. The generalist bees can use the pollen on many of those plants. So don't worry about the generalists. But if you plant a pollinator garden that only the generalists can use, you've lost all your specialist bees. What are we talking about here? Well, we're talking about specialization because flowers differ so much from each other. They differ in their flowering phenology when they actually appear. That includes daily. Some open in the morning, some open in the afternoon, some open at night. They look different. They smell different from each other. Their pollen morphology is species-specific. Each pollen looks different from each species. And bees adapt their leg hairs and other behaviors that allow them to pick up particular types of pollen grains. They get very efficient at it. Their nutritional value also varies widely. Different amino acids and lipids. Some pollens are protected with nasty compounds so that only the specialists can use them. Proteins vary in pollen from 5% to 90%. Huge differences. Starches, sterols, all these things are varying. So with all that variation out there in flowers, no wonder bees are specializing on particular types of plants so that they can gather the pollen in the most efficient way. So Sam and Jared have found that in New England, there are 57 bee species that only use 1 or 2 plant genera. Which means if you don't have those 1 or 2 plant genera, and unfortunately they're all different, you're not going to have 57 bee species. You can get the most specialists, typically with plants like goldenrod. Now notice we're talking about the genus level here, Solidago. 11 species of bees will only reproduce on goldenrods in New England. Willows next with 8 species, asters next with 7 species, blueberries 5 species. So just those 4 species, what's that, 12? I can't add up. We're up into 30 species of bees that you will not have at your yard if you don't have those plants. That's what I mean by planning for the specialist. And again, the generalists will go to those. So again, unfortunately, we don't know as much as we need to know about how many species of specialists are on different plant genera. But there's a lot of people working on it. Here's a similar list from the upper Midwest. 13 species on sunflowers. Sunflowers have taken over as number 1 there. 12 on asters, 11 on goldenrod. So goldenrod's still up there. Willow's still up there. So now we're up in the 40s. 40 species of bee that won't be there if you don't have those plant genera. So that's the way you should be thinking when you're thinking about your pollinator gardens, as opposed to putting in any plant with nectar that any generalist would go to and thinking that you're covering your base. Any plant from outside of this country is not going to address the needs of our specialists because our specialists never saw that plant before. They haven't adapted to it. So if we want Andrena asteroides, we need native asters. There's no compromise there. If we want Andrena eriginii, we need spring beauties. That's what they're going to go to. Coletes albescens requires false indigo. This is the type of specialization we're talking about. Where can you find out what our current knowledge of specialization is? You can go to Heather Holmes' latest book, Bees, an Identification and Native Plant Forage Guide. She tells you lots of things in that book, but she also tells you what our current state of knowledge is for bee specialists. Okay. Now, bees are critical. We need the bees. We need the bees to create that plant diversity that we're talking about. But in terms of contributing food directly to food webs, they're very unimportant. Very few things eat bees, and you can figure out why. Most things don't want to be stung. There are a few birds like western oriole, I think, and summer tanagers that specialize on bees and wasps, but very few. Most of the birds won't touch them, and other things aren't eating them. So what, again, is moving most of the energy from plants to animals? It is our caterpillars. Certainly not the only things, but we're going to focus on them, again, because they are transferring most of the energy out there. So let's use bird food webs as an example of how this actually happens. 96% of our birds are rearing their young on insects, and most of those insects are caterpillars. So let's ask the question, why caterpillars? There are not going to be any birds around if you don't have enough caterpillars. Again, having almost enough is not good enough. We've got to have enough. So we've got to figure out what is it about caterpillars that birds need. Then we have to figure out how to make all those caterpillars. So why caterpillars? I've been thinking about this, and it could be because they are beautiful. We've got a lot of beautiful caterpillars out there, like the Pandora Sphinx, the black-spotted prominent, the major Daytana, the purple-crested slug, the Sphingicampa caterpillar, the Coletta silk moth, the spiny rose caterpillar, our common black swallowtail, common but very beautiful, hieroglyphic moth, the spun glass caterpillar, that's my favorite. Or it could be because they have cool names, like the green marvel, the once charred punky, the confused wood grain, the cynical ground cat, the neighbor, the Donald. I know what some of you are thinking. It's not your caterpillar, I know. But actually, I don't really think it's because they're prettier, because they have cool names. I think there's some very practical reasons, and one of them is that most of these caterpillars are soft. That means you could stuff them down the throat of your offspring without fear of injuring the esophagus. And that's what these birds do. They get their beaks, they just ram it down like a plunger. They're also relatively large. One medium-sized caterpillar equals 200 aphids. So do you want to chase 200 aphids or get one caterpillar? They're nutritious. They're very high in protein. They're very high in fats. They have a very low percentage of chitin, of exoskeleton. Birds can't digest exoskeleton. So if you eat a beetle, you get a whole lot of exoskeleton, not that much food. You get just the opposite with caterpillars. And they're also the best source of carotenoids for birds when they are breeding. Birds get a lot of carotenoids from berries later on in the summer, but in the spring when they're breeding, the berries aren't produced yet. Why do I mention carotenoids? Because for two reasons. Vertebrates don't make them, so birds don't make them, we don't make them, yet they are critical components of our diets. And that's why my wife Cindy says I have to eat my carrots to get my beta-carotene, I have to eat my tomatoes to get my lycopene, my whatever that is to get my lutein. And she makes sure I eat all that stuff because they stimulate my immune system. They are antioxidants. They run around my body and they protect my DNA from oxidative damage. They improve color vision. When your mother said, eat your carrots, you'll see better, she was right. She didn't know she was right, but it turns out she was right. Improve sperm vitality, who doesn't need that? Improve sexual attractiveness. Now we're talking about, particularly the male birds like this prothonotary warbler. They take the carotenoids and they build pigments out of them. So this guy is bright yellow because he's had access to lots of luteins. And of course, the brighter yellow he is, the more ladies he attracts. Mr. Prothonotary is not eating plants when he's reproducing. Actually, he's never eating plants. He's a warbler. So he's got to get his carotenoids from something that did eat plants. And yes, that something is insects, but here's the key. Caterpillars have at least twice as many carotenoids as other types of insects. This is a data set that was an experiment run in Europe back in the 90s, I believe. 2010, okay. It was very valuable information to us. I showed it to our chemists at the University of Delaware, and they said, oh, they did it all wrong. So we said, oh, so we better repeat it. So we did repeat it. We had much bigger data set, a lot more types of insects. We got the results back 2 weeks ago, and in our results, the caterpillars were something like 15 times more carotenoids than other types of insects. And look, way more than spiders, which are important components of bird food webs. So it appears that for most birds, caterpillars are not optional parts of the diets. They're essential parts of the diets. If you're in an area that doesn't have enough caterpillars, you're not going to be able to breed successfully. How many is enough? Well, I turn to my friends, the chickadees, to tell us that 6,000 to 9,000 caterpillars required to get them to the point where they leave the nest. They're eating 350 to 570 caterpillars a day. And after they leave the nest, the parents continue to feed them caterpillars another 30 days, but nobody's counted them, so we don't know how many that is. So we're talking about thousands and thousands of caterpillars to make a tiny bird that's 1/3 of an ounce. And this is true for almost all of the birds that are out there. So how do we make that many types of caterpillars? Let's first talk about how not to make that many caterpillars. This, of course, this is a typical landscape these days. I call this Gone with the Wind, and that's what it looks like. I don't know how many acres this is, and I don't know how many thousands of species were there before it became a giant lawn. But it was several, I can tell you that. And they now are certainly gone with the wind. We have to stop worshiping the lawn. We have to stop having Lawn of the Month awards. This is St. Louis. People send me these pictures. So this family got an award for having the deadest landscape. It's part of our culture. We've got to turn that around. We add caterpillars to landscapes by adding the plants that make those caterpillars. Why do we do that? We do that because these caterpillars, 90% of the species of caterpillars that eat plants are what we call host plant specialists. They can only eat one or two plant lineages. What they do over evolutionary time, they pick a plant lineage that's sharing a common cocktail of chemical defenses. Plants protect themselves. They don't want to be eaten. So they protect themselves from insect herbivores by loading their leaves with nasty compounds. But the insects can get around those defenses by building enzymes and behavioral adaptations and life history adaptations that allow them to eat the plants without dying, but only after long periods of exposure to those plant lineages. You don't become a host plant specialist overnight. And that's why when we bring in burning bush and we make a hedge like this, it's making no insects. We're very, very few. We do have native euonymus, by the way, and those few can eat it. But it's very, very few because this has not been here long enough for all those adaptations to fall into place for any of the insects. And long enough is tens of thousands of years. It's not a few hundred years. Let's use the monarch as an example because you already know half the story of the monarch. It, of course, is a specialist on milkweeds. And milkweeds are toxic plants. They protect their tissues with compounds called cardiac glycosides. We don't eat milkweeds because cardiac glycosides would stop our heart. That's what they do. They don't stop the monarch's heart, and they do have a heart, by the way, because the monarchs have the enzymes that detoxify and store and excrete those compounds. They are adapted to eating them without dying. And that's half of the story. The other half of the story has to do with what gives milkweeds its name. Milkweeds are loaded with a sap, which is a sticky latex sap, that when it's exposed to air, it gels. So if you get that white stuff on your finger, next time before you wipe it off, just let it sit there, and it'll turn to a chewing gum-like substance. And that's the defensive property of this sticky latex sap. Insects that go on milkweed and try to eat it and get their mouth parts smeared with this sticky latex sap end up with their mouth parts glued shut, and then they starve to death. Very effective defense, and it's one of the reasons very few things can eat milkweeds. But monarchs can. So how do they crawl into a leaf and eat it without getting their mouth parts gummed up? Well, this is a behavioral specialization, and you can watch this right in your yard if you plant some milkweeds in your yard. The monarch will first crawl onto a leaf, typically goes to the end of the leaf and starts to eat, and if any latex sap starts to come out, it'll stop eating immediately, turn around, crawl back up the leaf about 2/3 of the way, and chew through the midrib. And what it's doing is it's behaviorally blocking the flow of latex sap from this end of the leaf to this end of the leaf. It's cut the latex canals. So with that simple behavior, it has now rendered this whole end of the leaf latex-free. Then it turns around and goes back down to the leaf and can eat without any latex sap at all. That's a specialized behavioral adaptation. Of course, when it does that, it flags the leaf. So this, if you're a monarch hunter, you can drive down the road and look at a milkweed patch and know whether it's got monarchs if you see any flagged leaves. Well, those are the upsides of specialization. Now the monarch can eat a toxic plant without dying, and it's eating a plant that most other insects can't eat. The downsides of specialization is that now that's all it can eat. So by specializing on the cardiac glycosides and latex sap of milkweeds, it has not specialized on the tannins that are in oak leaves, or the cucurbitacins in cucurbits, or the nicotine in tobacco, or the cyanide in native cherries, and on and on and on. And that means if you don't have milkweeds in your yard, you don't have any monarchs, because it's the only thing they can eat. This is what specialization is all about. If we're going to rebuild the insect diversity that's out there, we need to pay attention to host plant specialization. And that's why the plants from Asia won't ever do it, because none of our insects have specialized on it. And of course, we haven't been very nice to our milkweeds. We've never shared our residential landscapes very well with them. And we're not sharing our agricultural landscapes very well with them anymore. So we've lost 96% of our monarchs since 1976. There's a national effort to put them back. How? By planting milkweeds. Actually, that's half the story. That'll make the monarchs, but we have to also get them to Mexico. They have this fantastic migration. So they need forage plants. They need fall asters and goldenrods and things that bloom in the fall, so they have something to eat as they move south. So we can measure what happens when we don't pay attention to these relationships. When we bring in non-native plants from someplace else and we allow them to displace native plant communities. That's what we've been doing in my lab for the last, 11, 12 years. I have all these publications. You can read them and see what the answer is. We didn't try to make it easy for you, but we always get the same answer, so you can just read one. But I know you're not going to read any of them, so let's talk about an experiment you can do at home. I see a lot of kids in here. This is something you guys can do this summer. I call it my 12 by 12 experiment. This is 12 feet by 12 feet staked out. You get to determine how much life is going to be existing in that space by determining which plants are there and how many of them are there. This is your chance to play God. You get to determine how much life is going to be there. Now, you can count the biodiversity in this space if you keep it as lawn. Count it on Wednesday. Get on your hands and knees, count all the biodiversity. It won't take you long. And then, of course, on Saturday, you mow the lawn and kill everything. Or you can put a tree in it. Let's put a white oak. This is an oak I planted from an acorn, and it fills that 12 by 12 space very nicely. When did I do it? 14 years before I took that picture, which proves oaks grow. Next time a landscaper says, don't plant an oak, you won't live long enough to enjoy it, ignore him. I'm enjoying that tree. It doesn't have to be 300 years old before you can enjoy it. It also was free, by the way, which I like. All right, let's do our 12 by 12. Let's count the caterpillars that are on that tree just at head height. We're going to walk around and inspect the leaves, inspect the stems. We're not going to climb any ladders, and we're going to do it on July 25th of 2014, and we're going to find 410 caterpillars from 19 different species right there. And then I'm going to stand back and take that picture immediately after I finish counting those caterpillars, so I can ask you, how many of the caterpillars do you see? How much caterpillar damage do you see? That's what we worry about. You don't see any. This is the distance at which we view our trees. But if I knocked on your door and said, you've got 410 caterpillars on your oak tree, get the spray can, call the man, save the tree. You don't have to save the tree. This is what oaks have been doing for literally millions of years, interacting with insects. Because they're willing to share part of their energy with the caterpillars in my yard, I have life in my yard. If they didn't share any of it, I wouldn't have it. I'd have a green tree and nothing else. I met a woman named Tallamy Baumgarten in New Orleans this past year, and she suggests that we practice the 10-step program. She says, take 10 steps back from your trees and all of your insect problems will disappear. All right, now we'll go to a black cherry. Same day, count the caterpillars, 12 by 12, bottom branches, 239 caterpillars from 14 different species. Now let's go to my neighbor's house. My neighbor moved in the same month that we did, same size property. He had different plant choices. He really liked Callery pear, Bradford pear, so he planted 32 of them. So the first thing we have to do is choose which Callery pear we're going to measure. Actually, the first thing we have to do is make sure he's not home. Let's measure this one. One caterpillar, one species, 1 inchworm on the Callery pear. Then we'll go to his burning bush. And of course, Callery pear and burning bush are invasive species. They are from Asia, highly invasive ornamentals that I have to pull out of my property all the time, little gifts from my neighbor. 12 by 12 section of his burning bush, I found 4 caterpillars from one species, 4 little leaf skeletonizers. Well, in science, we don't just make this stuff up. We measure things and count things and look at the numbers. I say I'm a follower. I follow the data. But how do you create the data? You have to do an experiment in the correct way. And one of the things you do is replicate. If you get a pattern the first time, maybe it's by chance. Chance does happen. So you want to replicate it a number of times. Let's do it again the next day, July 26th. Same species but different trees. And we get the same pattern. We get different numbers, but the same pattern. 233 on the white oak, 53 in the black cherry, 2 in the burning bush, 1 on the Callery pear. And that is the pattern you're going to get no matter how many times you do this. There are a few genera of native plants that are producing most of the food. These plants from Asia can't do it because they don't have the specialized relationships to support our native caterpillars. Rick Dark and I gave a talk in Williamsburg, Virginia. Not this spring, but 2 springs ago. After the talk, we drove across the Bay Bridge, up the eastern shore of Maryland, and the first building you get to after you pass the bridge is the Sunset Beach Inn and Grill. And it just happened to be the time of year that all their calorie pears were in full bloom. And this is why people plant them. They have a very nice spring bloom if you like white. They're the cheapest tree you can buy. I'm sure that has something to do with it. Pretty good fall color. They don't last very long. You get the ice storm and down they come. So maybe 30 years. These guys are definitely at the end of their lifetime. Okay, kept driving right past the Sunset Beach Inn and Grill, and we got to this property, which is owned by a land conservancy. I don't know how many acres it is, but look, it is thoroughly invaded with the offspring from these trees. So this is the horticultural dilemma of our times, our ethical dilemma. We talk about property rights, and anybody would argue, well, the Sunset Beach Inn and Grill has a right to plant anything they want on their property. Okay, but do they have the right to biologically pollute all the land around them? To ecologically castrate it? This is the plant making one caterpillar. My chickadees are not going to be able to reproduce on it. And neither is any other bird. And I can drive from New York City to Richmond, Virginia at the time these guys are blooming, and it is white all the way down. I could go all the way to Florida. I don't know. That's what an invasive species does. So what you put on your property does affect other people, other properties, either for the good or for the bad. Okay, so the point here is that plant choice matters. The plants we pick for our properties matter. If I want to have the Pandora Sphinx at my house, I have to have Virginia creeper. I do want the Pandora Sphinx, and I did plant Virginia creeper, and I got the Pandora Sphinx. It's a beautiful moth. But when I did that, you also get Abbott Sphinx, you get Virginia creeper Sphinx, you get a number of other insects. If I want the tulip tree silk moth, I have to have tulip trees. But then I also get the tulip tree beauty. If I want Luna moths, the best planter in here for Luna moths would be sweet gum. But then I also get the large pectes. You're not going to get the beautiful zebra swallowtail without pawpaw, but then you also get the pawpaw sphinx. Our native grapes give us lots of things. The eight-spotted forester moth, the pearly wood nymph, the beautiful wood nymph, the greater grapevine looper, the lesser grapevine looper, lots of things on native grapes. Viburnums give us the green marvel, and the horrid zale, and of course many others like the hummingbird sphinx moth. The rose hooktip moth, all on our native viburnums. Goldenrod, that's a top-producing herbaceous plant for caterpillars. Give us the Arcigera flower moth, the brown hooded owlet, and of course many others. Poison ivy will give us the beautiful Utilia. And I know what you're thinking, poison ivy, I can't have poison ivy at home. You know when you get poison ivy? When you're trying to pull it out. Ignore your poison ivy. You can run faster than it can, I guarantee. Then you also get the eyed pectes. Our persimmon will give us the small necklace moth, also the sculptured moth. Black gum is going to give us the Hebrew and the false underwing, two-toned ancillus on ironwood. Ashes give us a lot of things. Our poor ashes give us the beautiful wave sphinx and the even more beautiful fawn sphinx. Maples, the rosy maple moth, the large maple spanworm, bantam maple dagger moth. This is the most spectacular caterpillar in North America, the hickory horned devil, either on walnut or hickory. It's about 7 inches long, and the adult is equally spectacular, the royal walnut moth. Elms also give us the double-toothed prominent and very, very cool caterpillar, I think. And the elm sphinx and the interrupted dagger moth, the orange-headed epicalema. Our witch hazel will give it the witch hazel dagger moth, the mustard sallow. Our imperial moths typically will be on pine, so will the eastern panthea. Even our clematis, our native clematis, will give us spotted thyrus. Greenbrier, we don't like greenbrier, but look at that beautiful caterpillar, the curved line owlet, only on greenbrier. Our blueberries, in between the blueberries, will give us the Drexel's daytana. Lost owlet on buttonbush, the herald on native willows, snowberry clearwing on coral honeysuckles, beautiful evening primrose moth on evening primrose. The showy emerald on sumac, and I'm not talking about poison sumac here. I've never seen poison sumac. This is the staghorn sumac or smooth sumac. It's a great soil stabilizer for banks. Goldenrod stowaway, beautiful orange yellow moth on ditch daisy, Biden's aristosa. Our ferns don't produce that many moths, but they do produce the pink-shaded fern moth. Even dodder, a parasitic plant, makes the obtuse yellow. Then we get to the real powerhouses, our black cherry, with a really fancy white furcula. Crocus geometer, many of our giant silk moths are on black cherry, like the Io moth. The colorful zale is there. The the cecropia moth. You know, if you want to get your kids interested in nature, if they run into one of these guys, they're hooked, believe me. You can tell them, go outside and look for the cecropia moth any time of the year. They're only around as adults for, you know, maybe a week if you're lucky, but they're around as eggs for maybe 6 days. They're around as larvae for a month, and then the rest of the year they're a cocoon. But you can find one of those stages just by looking. And then there's a connection with what's happening in your yard. Black cherry also gives us the tufted bird-dropping moth, the paddle caterpillar. Ask your kids what those paddles are for. They have a function, and I'm not going to tell you what it is, so you can think about it. The small-eyed sphinx, the filament geometer, same function for these guys up here. Harris's three-spot that wears his old shed head capsules as an umbrella over its head. Nobody knows why he does that. Then oaks, remember the most powerful moth, they are the most powerful tree we can plant. Will give us the hag moth that people say thinks it's a tarantula, the red-washed prominent, the white-dotted prominent, the spiny oak caterpillar, the skiff moth, the oblique or the white-blotched heterocampa, the oak skeletonizer, polyphemus moth, half-oval ancillus, the barred white Taenius, my favorite, the spun-glass slug, the puss caterpillar, and literally hundreds more will be on our oaks. I dragged you through all those pictures because I like to do that. I'm trying to make a point here. I took all those pictures at home, at my house, and that's what our house looked like when we moved in. It was mowed for hay, as I said, so not much there. That's what it looked like two summers ago from the same perspective, and I am now religiously counting the moth species that I have taken pictures of. I'm up to 805 species in that little space. Then they weren't there before we put the plants back. We planted witch hazel and oaks and persimmons and American elm, red maple, white, but all the way down to ironwood here. We tolerated these guys. Black cherry, most people think it's a weed. Get rid of it. Get rid of it. New York fern, grapes, tulip tree, Virginia creeper. Get rid of it. Even dodder, poison ivy. We tolerate it, and we get all of those things. And, of course, many, many more that I didn't show you. And because we have all of those moths, we have the things that eat those moths. We now have a population of wood thrush, which is great because they're declining. Because we've got the lettered sphinx, which develops on Virginia creeper. We have indigo bunnings because we've got ruby quakers on alder. We have chipping sparrows because we have gray-edged bomoloca on black walnut. We have field sparrows because we have the red-line panapodas on those oaks. We have our tufted titmice because we have dowdy pinions on black cherry. We certainly have our chickadees because we've got tulip tree beauty on tulips. We've got our white-eyed vireas because we have spicebush swallowtail and our spicebush and our sassafras. We've got our house wrens because we've got copper underwings on hickories, and our bluebirds because we've got drab prominence on sycamore, and you get the picture. We have 54 species of breeding birds at our house because we put the plants back. So here's our tree, 410 caterpillars on the lower branches there. It is not defoliated. And that's what people worry about. All these moths are going to defoliate everything. No, they're not, because we also have the natural enemies that control those guys. So which plants should we have in our landscapes? We'll talk about this quickly. Yeah, if you memorize that, you got it. This is a list we made several years ago. For one reason, but it's a ranking of the woody plant genera in mid-Atlantic states. The little numbers after each plant genus are the number of species of caterpillars that use that plant as a host plant. And they're ranked from the ones, the most powerful ones down to the least powerful ones. We've now made a list for this is the mid-Atlantic states, but we now have a list for every county in every state of the Union. And it is on the National Wildlife Federation website called Native Plant Finder. All you have to do is put in your zip code, and the ranked list of woody plants and herbaceous plants, in terms of their power of supporting food webs, will pop up for your county. This is a newly launched website. If you find mistakes on it, let us know. It's not perfect, but it's getting there. It's getting there. But now you don't have any excuse to say, I don't know which plants to plant. These are the plants you want to plant if you want to make the most insects. I'm sorry about the spacing here. It keeps changing every time I show it. But this is what the top ones for Lancaster County will be. There's oaks number 1, 525 species of caterpillars just on oaks, just in this county, followed by black cherries, pincherry 443, willows typically number 3, 395, birch is very high, 382. So these guys are the really powerful one. Here are the powerful herbaceous plants. So that's, and there's pretty pictures that go with all of them. That's what it's going to look like. But when we made this list and looked at it for all over the U.S., we saw a very striking pattern. There were actually very few plant genera that are making most of the food. And I started calling them foraging hubs. I borrowed a term from people that study birds foraging on fruit in the tropics. The trees that make a lot, like figs, make a lot of fruit, so they call them foraging hubs. I have learned that you people don't like that term. But this was my reasoning. I was sitting on a Delta plane one day, not going anywhere. So I was looking at the Delta magazine, and there were the Delta hubs. And that's a visual representation of what I'm talking about. Let's make them foraging hubs. There you go. An oak, a pine, a cherry, a willow. Now, all the lines going into this oak here, each one could be a bird. It could be a species of bird. It could be a lizard. It's something going into that tree because that tree has a lot of food to offer. There are other dots in this landscape. They are plants too, and there are lines going into those dots, but not very many lines because they're not making very much food. It's just very simple. The animals go where the food is. So imagine what would happen if I took these 4 plant genera out of the landscape and left all these other black dots there, all those other plant species. I'd have a failed food web. Still plenty of plants, it'd be green, but it wouldn't be making the food that we need to run this food web. And it turns out that just 5% of the local plant genera are producing between 73 and 75% of the food. Which means I could build a plant landscape using entirely native genera, using 95% of my options. But if I didn't include these guys, I'd only make 25 to 27% of the food that I need, which would be a failed food web. So yes, we want native plants, but we also want the right native plants. We've got to have, let's call them keystone genera. How about that? We build the structure of our food web with these keystone genera, then we can diversify with all of these other ones. It's a new concept, but it's one that we can't ignore. And if we do ignore it, we're not fooling the birds. Here's a little bit of data from my PhD student, Desiree Narango, who's working with chickadee breeding success in the suburbs of Washington, D.C. She's looking at their breeding success in relation to the landscape in which they're breeding. So here's one pair of chickadees. This is their foraging territory. It represents 95% of the foraging they did to feed the babies in this nest right here where the store is. And the blue areas are the plants on which they did that foraging. So that's basswood, sweet gum, American elm, black cherry, 2 species of oaks, all the native plants in this neighborhood. Well, let's also look at the plants they were not foraging on, and those are all the non-native plants. Japanese maple, silk tree, they're all the Asian plants. Ginkgos, black poplar, crepe myrtle, saucer magnolia. And you know as well as I do, it's very easy to find a neighborhood where those are the dominant plants. Here's a summary of what Desiree found when she compared landscapes that were primarily native with landscapes, these are suburban landscapes just like your yards, with suburban landscapes that are primarily introduced plants. The introduced landscapes had produced 75% fewer caterpillars. They were 60% less likely to have any chickadees at all. Even though she put a nest box up, the chickadees came and they said, there's not enough food here, we're not gonna even try. If they did try, they laid 1.5 fewer eggs. It was 29% less likely to survive as a nest. It produced 1.2 fewer fledglings and delayed maturation by 1.5 days. You add up all of those effects, and this is what you get. This is the population growth model, looking at the population of the chickadees she looked at as a function of the non-native plants in the landscape. The dotted line is replacement rate. When the chickadees were producing enough chicks to replace the adults that were lost each year, that's the dotted line. And that's the only thing that's sustainable, by the way. Anything below the dotted line is not a sustainable population. Well, here the error bars exceed the dotted lines, and that's around 20% non-native plants. When you have more than 20% non-native plants, you dip well below the replacement rate, and your landscape becomes an ecological sink. It draws these birds in, but they can't reproduce enough to replace themselves. And this effect is so powerful, it happens all within the first 16 days of their life, 1% of the chickadee's lifespan, because that's the only time they're in the nest. As soon as they fledge, they and their parents go to a good landscape. They leave the lousy landscapes with all the non-native plants not making the caterpillars, and they go off to find a better place. Yet, the legacy of what occurred when they were in that nest follows them all the way through their life. Very powerful effect. One more point to leave you with. How we plant these trees is really important for the moth's survival, the moths that we're trying to create in our landscapes. Here's a little data from Pennsylvania. 511 species of caterpillars just on oaks in Pennsylvania. A few of them can complete their life cycle on the oak tree. Here's the polyphemus moth. It fed as a larva up on the tree, then spun its cocoon hanging from the tree, so it never leaves the tree. Everything's great with the polyphemus moth. But most don't do that. 480 of those species, 94%, do leave the tree in order to pupate. They either drop from the tree and pupate underground in the soil, or they form a cocoon in the leaf litter under the tree under natural situations. But of course, we don't put trees in natural situations. So when the caterpillars drop out of these trees, there's no leaf litter to form their cocoon. This is hard, compacted, mowed lawn. They won't be able to tunnel into it. They might crawl off and get squished by the car. But we're not thinking about the entire life cycle. Even if these are all oaks, I can't tell if they are. It's going to draw species in, but not allow them to complete their life cycle. And of course, the cement landscape is even a worse option. So what do? Well, we create exactly what they need. Here's a tulip tree. This is Mount Cuba Center, by the way, if anybody wants to visit it. Here's a blooming native azalea, nice ferns, our spring ephemerals, lots of material for the caterpillar to fall down there. They won't look for anything else. Straight underground, or they'll spin their cocoon. And it's also an area where you're not going to be walking, compacting the soil. So it's going to be doing lots of things. It's going to be sequestering carbon. It's going to be helping your watershed. It's going to be beautiful. And it's going to be making your moths. You build a layered landscape that allows, again, so you're creating habitat for nesting birds and other things. Here's a birch tree that, this is up in Alaska, by the way. Those are elderberries from the west. But again, the moths will do very well in a situation like this. Spring ephemerals, if you want to have a nice ephemeral garden, or your ground covers like mayapple or ginger or native pachysandra. We really don't need pachysandra from Asia. Perfect place for those moths to complete their life cycle. Finally, our security lights are killing moths. Many of these moths do not have mouth parts as adults. So they emerge with all the energy they're ever going to have. And if they spend all that energy flying around your security light at night, they're done. And then they haven't laid their eggs, they haven't found their mates, or the bat comes and picks them off. So security lights are moth killers. There was a study recently done in Europe that showed, it was an interesting study. They put night goggles on and they looked at a field with a lot of flowering plants at night, and they counted the moths that were out there. Then they erected street lights in the same field, and there was a decline of those moths by 62% where the lights were. So our lights are another factor reducing the insects that are out there, particularly our night pollinating moths. You can have your security lights, but put them on motion sensors. Supposedly, it's a security against the bad guy, right? So when the bad guy comes, they turn on. He doesn't know the light's there, so it's a surprise. He runs away. If the light's on all the time, he sees where the dark shadows are, and he avoids it. It's easy. All right. By choosing the right plants, is what we're talking about tonight, and using more of them in our landscapes, we really could make the insects that are running the world that EO talks about. We could recreate nature's relationships pretty much everywhere. This could become our new landscaping paradigm, and few people would object to that. So let's end by talking about EO again. He is retired. He's professor emeritus at Harvard. He's 87 now, but he still writes a book every year. And the book he wrote last year is called Half Earth. Has anybody read this? Good. Usually there's one person in the audience. Now we've got 3. That's super. It's a depressing book. EO says we are not going to save life on this planet, and he's talking about everything, including us, if we don't preserve functioning ecosystems on half of the planet. Half of the planet includes the ocean, includes the land systems. But remember, half of the planet is already in agriculture. And we are in the other half. All 7.4 billion of us, all of our infrastructure, all of our 4 million miles of paved roads just in the U.S., all of our stuff is in the other half. So how are we going to preserve half of it and still have our agriculture and realize EO's dream of saving life on Earth? And of course, we have to do that unless we want to lose life on Earth or go to Mars. I think we can do it. I think we can realize EO's dreams, but we need a new approach to conservation to do that. You know, the UN designates biosphere reserves, the really rich places on Earth, as places of ecological significance. But I think that's a tactical error. Every place has ecological significance, including my neighbors down the street. And we have to start treating those places as if they had ecological significance. The diversity's gone, but we can put it back. We can put it back. So in addition to saving biodiversity where there are no humans, we have to save biodiversity where we abound, which is pretty much everywhere. You don't have to save biodiversity for a living, but you really do have to save it where you live if EO is going to have his wish, and I hope he does. I like this approach because it empowers each one of us. Each one of us becomes a really critical component of today's modern drive for conservation. We can do this. I really believe that we can do this. I know that we must do this. And I know what the Donald says. Make America's insects again. All right, thank you very much.